It's good to be with you here tonight. I want to thank you for another gracious welcome to come and spend some time with you, and bring greetings from my wife and our two kids. And my boy had a road accident 2 weeks ago going down to Southern, and we're grateful he's still alive. And so he had a double blowout at 10 o'clock at night on the interstate. So they pulled to one side, and the police said, wait until the truck comes and hauls you away. So he fell asleep, and a car plowed into the back, and then a semi plowed into the back. And the car was like sandwiched down like this, but he walked away with just minor cuts and bruises. So you realize how tenuous life is, and life is a gift from God. And so we're going to be talking this weekend about a few things. So tomorrow afternoon, we're going to focus mostly on questions about COVID and questions of conscience. And tomorrow we have a regular sermon on one of the healing ministries of Jesus, because we're talking about COVID in the afternoon. Tomorrow for Sabbath school, we're going to be talking about how the Adventist Church has responded to totalitarian claims by governments historically, and what lessons do we have for us here in America right now. That's called more of a religious liberty kind of topic. And tonight we're going to talk about something that I spoke here about 4 years ago on the question of transgenderism. Some of you may have been here when I spoke about that. I'm going to talk tonight about the broader changes that are happening in America, because things are coming to a boil right now. And we talk about the sexual revolution going on in America and across the West. Well, it's not something that you can just pretend isn't happening. And it's not something that is not going to have an impact on this church here eventually, and how you live your lives and how our children live their lives as well. So I'm going to go over some of the history tonight of that revolution. Some of it you may already know. A lot of it you probably were vaguely aware of. But when you see where it's going, it's very, very clear that America is at a crossroads in what kind of society it wishes to be, and what it tolerates and what it does not tolerate, and what it allows for in terms of freedom of conscience and religious liberty. So it's an interesting story, and given the fact that we have minors here, I'm going to adjust my language somewhat. So does that work? Yeah, you can all read that clear, yes? All right, so we're going to start out in the 1940s in Nebraska. And there was a doctor there called Dr. Miller, and he was a state physician and state health director, and he was interested in the question of homosexuality. And he argued that male homosexuals have uncontrollable urges. They kind of fall out of control in the same way that a woman has her menstrual cycle, and that the job of the state was to help such men regulate those desires through large doses of sedatives. That was his kind of idea, and that became very popular in Nebraska in the 40s. It became so popular, and Dr. Arthur Miller became so well known that he was elected to Congress. And when he got to Congress in the late 1940s, he authored what was known as the Sexual Psychopath Law. It was known colloquially as the Miller Act, and that made certain acts punishable by up to 20 years in prison, but first you had to be examined by a psychiatric team. And if there were repeated such performances, male to male, then you would not be diagnosed as criminally insane per se, or as a criminal, but you were classified as being a sexual psychopath. And you were to be admitted to the psychiatric unit of the St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Washington, D.C. Now, President Truman, he signed this law into the Miller Act into law in June 1948. And what was happening in America at that time was that Truman needed to show that he was tough on communists. We were just starting the Cold War. And anybody who was viewed as deviant in any way from what society viewed as normal, President Truman had to be tough on to show that he was tough on the Reds, as you might call it. Now, throughout the 1940s, the police departments across our nation, they actively hunted for those with same-sex attraction in bars, clubs, and other gay meeting places. Sting operations were very common. There was a lot of physical brutality towards this particular group within our society. And in fact, California, hard to imagine, they established what became known as the ABC, the Alcohol Beverage Control Department. And their official title was to control alcohol, maintain public safety in bars, but unofficially they were hunting for gay hotspots and they were closing down those hotspots. In popular culture, such people were called perverts and psychopaths, and there was very significant public hostility towards this minority group within our nation. Now, in the 1950s, moving on to the 50s, the American Psychiatric Association, they produced what is known as the DSM. That is the Bible for psychiatrists. And their first edition classified homosexuality as a pathological disorder. And so popular literature of the time, poetry, music, really portrayed homosexuality as a social taboo as the result of sexual maladjustment. Something went wrong in your raising as a child. It was a problem of nurture in the home environment. And there was a very popular perception in American society in the 50s that such attraction could be cured by psychoanalysis, through residential group therapy, through insulin therapy, electroshock treatments, and even frontal lobotomies. And wealthy parents used to pay for their children to go through the whole range of these treatments at psychiatric hospitals in America, mostly on the coastal areas. Electroshock treatments. Today we use electroconvulsive therapy, don't we, for people with chronic depression. We tie them to a bed and we put a high current through them. And that can actually lift people out of severe depression for 2 or 3 months. Then they have to go back and repeat the whole process. So we still use, in some parts of America, electroconvulsive therapy. I used to work in mental health care in England in a previous incarnation, and that was still quite common back in the 90s to give people electroshock therapy. But in the 1950s, parents who had children with such desires, they paid a lot of money for their children to have these various treatments. And the bottom line was that it really didn't cure anybody of anything. They just went through a lot of suffering and didn't cure anybody of anything. So in 1945, Truman signed Executive Order 9835, known as the Federal Employee Loyalty Program. Now that established review boards to work across all the US federal government agencies to identify and to fire any individual suspects of disloyalty to the US. And of course, it wasn't just that you were a member of the Communist Party. If you were suspected of homosexuality, you were viewed as a security risk because you could be blackmailed. And so Truman needed to show that he was tough on communists and Reds under the bed, you might say. And so he wanted to show he was a true Cold War warrior. And so with Secretary of State George Marshall's blessing, maybe you know George Marshall, he was the guy that rebuilt Europe, the Marshall Plan after World War II. One of his associates, a guy called John Purifoy, he began rooting out homosexuals within the State Department using the powers under this executive order. The State Department was viewed as a haven or a natural retreat for people with those inclinations, and it was viewed as a hotbed of Soviet spying as well. So at this time, homosexuals were viewed as morally deviant and open to blackmail by foreign powers. It was believed that such activity weakened your moral fiber and had a corrosive impact on your work colleagues. And so the US Senate decided that the executive branch of the federal government had to be purged. And a federal subcommittee was formed, led by Senator, Clyde Huey of North Carolina. By April 1950, over 500 federal employees had been forced out of their work across the United States. And just as today, where the federal government says something and corporations are jumping in line with the federal government, say on COVID vaccination mandates, in the 1950s, the federal government indicated that it was okay to purge homosexuals from employment, and so US corporations started purging people themselves. In fact, tens of thousands of people were thrown out of employment in the 50s by US corporations. When Dwight Eisenhower became president, he signed Executive Order 10450, naming as security risks those who were communist for obvious reasons, those who were also morally subversive, such as the drunks, the dishonest, the drug users, and what he called sexual perverts. And once again, as under Truman, so under Eisenhower, there was a push to purge those with same-sex attraction from all federal positions across the United States. And tens of thousands of people were fired. There were very intrusive investigations. It was extremely painful for those involved. Some people were falsely accused and lost their careers in the process. And across America, private corporations such as Ford, etc., they engaged in the same winnowing out process. So the 1940s and 50s, it was a time of systematic exclusion from employment opportunities. There was police brutality against this particular minority group within US society, and people kind of were very much in the closet. They didn't want to come out because they were afraid of losing all their standing in society. Within the US military, FDR, before he became president, was the Assistant Secretary to the Navy, and he had assigned investigators to trawl the bars around the major ports of the United States, looking for sailors who might have those inclinations so they could be dishonorably discharged. Now, in the 1920 Articles of War, the military code of conduct that criminalized homosexual behavior, but if you look at the history of this in the US military, every time there was a war, they needed more men at the front lines. They kind of relaxed those standards, and after the war's finished, then people were discharged, and those who often discharged the first were those who had homosexual tendencies. And so by 1944, in World War II, homosexual recruits faced very intrusive psychiatric examination. But after World War II, the US military shrank by 90%, and once again, as in the 20s and the 30s, homosexuals were actively rooted out. And Army Regulation 600-443 described three kinds of homosexuals and how they were to be treated. So the first were the aggressively homosexual. They were to be court-martialed. The non-aggressives were to be offered resignation or be dishonorably discharged, and those merely with tendencies could receive an honorable discharge. And so the US military was very aggressive in rooting out people with same-sex attraction during the 40s, 50s, and 60s, but particularly after the wars, like World War II and after the Korean War, discharges, they soared after those wars, but they kind of faded away in the middle of the conflict because everybody was needed on the front lines. When it came to women in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, in America in 1950, America promoted motherhood, apple pie, for women and marriage. That was kind of like your chosen career. If you were an upstanding lady, you aspired to become a wife and to make apple pies and have a white picket fence. Now, as a result of this, many ladies with same-sex attraction, they were very much attracted to the US military. Now, why were they attracted? They were attracted because in the military they could earn a regular pay with benefits and earn GI Bill benefits, and they would never have to have a husband to support them. They could be financially independent if they went into the military. And so as a result of that, it's believed that many, many ladies with same-sex attraction, they served in the various arms of the US Armed Forces, such as the Voluntary Emergency Services, the Women in the Air Force, WAF, and the Marine Corps Women's Reserve. And there was a motto in the 50s, be neat and discreet. That was a very common motto among ladies with same-sex attraction. Be neat, be discreet, don't be loud and about, and you'll get through your career and you'll earn your GI Bill benefits and you have no need of a husband. And so the US military was kind of a haven for ladies with same-sex attraction during the 1950s. Now, set against that kind of background of federal government hostility, corporate hostility, public hostility, and police hostility towards those with same-sex attraction, we then come to the start of what people now call the gay rights movement. And it's, you can trace the roots back. I mean, if you want to go all the way back, you can go back to ancient Greece, okay? The Spartans and the Corinthians, their armed forces, they were into this in a big way. But in the modern era, we start out with a guy called the Scientific Humanitarian Committee, established by a guy called Magnus Hirschfeld in Germany in 1897. And he wanted to decriminalize homosexuality. Now, he plays a key role later in the 20s and 30s in the first movements towards transgenderism, but we won't talk much about that tonight. You have the Society for Human Rights, 1924. That was closed down by the police here in the States within a few weeks of opening. You had the Veterans Benevolent Association. They were established to stop GIs who were dishonorably discharged from losing their GI Bill benefits. But the first real activist was a guy called Harry Hay. 1950, he adopted what we now recognize as a critical theory worldview, and he argued that homosexuals were an oppressed cultural minority, and he established an organization called Mattachine over there in the Bay Area near San Francisco. And that organization fought against the entrapment of homosexuals by police, against police brutality, police violence, police beating up people in gay bars. And for the first time in US political history, he started to link the issue of those who are homosexual with having civil rights and civil protections under the US Constitution. Now this thing here, an oppressed cultural minority within a Marxist communist worldview, if you've seen any of my sermons online, you know what I'm talking about there. Karl Marx argued that the world is divided into the bourgeoisie, those are the ones who own the factories, and the proletariat, those are the ones who work in the factories. And he argued that the proletariat had to have a worldwide revolution to overthrow the bourgeoisie, the capitalists, and to replace them with a classless society where everybody's needs would be met. But when that didn't work by the 1920s and 30s, Marxism kind of evolved, and so rather than talking about society divided into bourgeoisie and proletariat, the cultural Marxists started arguing that society is divided into the oppressors and the oppressed. And that's what we have today with whether it's critical theory, critical gender theory, critical race theory, LGBTQ studies. They all use that basic framework that you have the oppressors and then you have the oppressed, and you have a hierarchy of oppression. And so Harry Hay started talking about this in the 1950s, arguing that homosexuals were an oppressed minority under the oppressive heterosexual American society. So in April 1953, they held a constitutional convention in the Bay Area, and many of the members were driven by fears over Marxism and the secretive leadership style of Harry Hay. Now, what's significant about that meeting in April 1953 was that was the very first time in US history that a public hall full of men with same-sex attraction gathered openly, without hiding, without any shame, and they were arguing about their political objectives. What do we want to accomplish politically as a section within society? There were many speakers there. They spoke about different things, and some of these things you'll recognize. They spoke of their pride in their condition, and they anticipating marching down Hollywood Boulevard, arm in arm, proclaiming such a pride. And one lady, lesbian Marilyn Rieger, spoke of the need for homosexuals to come out into the open, or to come out of the closet, as it were. In the 1950s, the lesbians were struggling to get their voice heard because the gay rights movement was dominated by homosexual men. And so the lesbians in America decided to form an organization called Daughters of Bilitis, and they decided to publish a magazine called The Ladder. And The Ladder was a bit like Cosmopolitan magazine today. The purpose of it was to raise the profile of women with same-sex attraction, and to let people know that there was a sizable lesbian community within the United States. And they actually did a very good job of doing that. They had very high-profile women from different aspects of the legal profession, the teaching profession, and some other professional groups, and they raised their profile. They also wanted to roll back the vagrant lewd laws, vag-lewd as they were known. This was often used to entrap people with the vag-lewd laws and the anti-homosexuality laws. Those were the laws that the police used to enable them to do sting operations. And so the Daughters of Bilitis were the first real kind of movement among the ladies in the lesbian movement, trying to raise their profile in America. Now, in 1964, we're moving forward in time now, there was a dialogue between homosexual community leaders and liberal pastors in the San Francisco Bay Area. And this was called the Council on Religion and the Homosexual, and it was established to promote an ongoing dialogue between the church, these were liberal Protestant churches, and the homosexual community. Now, in the 1960s, as we know, there was the civil rights movement as well. And pastors were encouraged to say, well, you can march with the civil rights movements in the streets. Why don't you stand with the homosexual community and their desire for justice? They don't want to be beaten up by the police every time they go out for a drink with their friends, for instance. And so out of that council, they established a principle, and the principle was this, that love is the ultimate and the only norm of conduct. And what they meant by love was not what maybe you and I would understand the word love to mean. It was basically free love anywhere, with whomever, however you wish it, with no moral boundaries whatsoever. It's whoever I want to hook up within the next 24 hours. And whatever you want to do, whoever you want to be with, that must be normalized, that must be okay. Well, the council was going quite well. They had a lot of meetings. But in 1965, they decided to hold a Mardi Gras ball over there in San Francisco. And they had the mayor there were some civic leaders there was some leaders of the homosexual community, a lot of pastors were there, and for some reason the local police department decided to do a raid at the ball. And what they hadn't counted on was the fact that there was already a lot of media there. And so the police stormed into the hall with their truncheons raised and bringing them down on people, and this was done in the full view of the West Coast media. And this raised a public outcry. Like people said, these guys weren't doing anything wrong. They were having a ball. They were there with the pastors and some church members. And this caused a public outcry. And this was maybe the start of the turning point in police brutality against the homosexual community, particularly on the West Coast. This was maybe the start of the turning point in the attitudes that you can go up and you can do entrapment and you can beat people up and so forth. So in the early 1960s, police raids on gay bars began to be met with taunts, hurled furniture, food, and stuff was thrown at them by the patrons. And in 1966, a 27-year-old guy called Steve Ginsburg started what he called Pride. You've heard of Pride? Pride Week, Pride Marches, Pride Month, etc. It doesn't mean pride as in I'm proud of something. It's actually an acronym. It means Personal Rights in Defense and Education. And so he started this to protest the arbitrary arrest and violence of the homosexual community by the local police. And so they started to arrange for pride marches on the police stations to protest what they called the abuse of their civil rights. And so pride marches started springing up, particularly on the West Coast, targeting police stations that were particularly well known for their violence towards the homosexual community. So when we talk about pride marches today, the pride marches are essentially saying, like, we're here and please don't give us any trouble, okay? We're not an oppressed minority that you can beat up and you can just haul off to the police cells whenever you wish. So they've come a long way. Now, after Harry Hay, the next, or perhaps the most important person in the gay rights movement was a guy called Frank Kameny. Now, I've yet to figure out, I've looked for him online, was his name pronounced Frank Kameny or Kameny? I don't know. So I don't want to disrespect the guy. He's dead now, died a few years ago, but I'm going to call him Kameny. He was in the Navy, and they discovered he was homosexual, so he was discharged in the Navy. And he was very upset about this. And many people, when they were discharged, kind of slunk home and they kind of didn't want to talk about it. But he was a brilliant thinker. He was a very gifted astronomer. He'd been doing some astronomical work within the Navy. And so he decided to lead a militant gay rights movement in the Washington, D.C. area. He marched with MLK in the March on Washington in April '63. And he lobbied Congress for the civil rights of the African American community. He also argued for the full equal civil rights of the homosexual community with the heterosexual community. Now, he argued that if homosexuals sat around and waited for heterosexual America to grant homosexuals their civil rights, they would never get those rights. Therefore, the homosexual community had to basically claim those rights for themselves, regardless of what wider American society thought about the situation. Frank Kameny, no matter what you may think about the morality of it, he was a brilliant campaigner. He knew what he was doing. He mobilized a lot of people very effectively, and he fought many cases in the law courts. I mentioned up there Barbara Gittings. Barbara Gittings was a lesbian, a very high-profile campaigner in the 60s and 70s. They often worked together. And there were two major decisions in 69 and 68, Scott versus Macy and Norton versus Macy. And what was happening was Kameny would say to somebody who'd been discharged, either from the military or from the U.S. Civil Service, because of their homosexuality, he was encouraging them to fight in the federal courts on the basis that their civil rights had been broken. And so after those two cases in 69 and 68, the Civil Service Commission ceased its policy of firing homosexuals and of refusing to hire homosexuals. And by December 1973, the U.S. Civil Service Commission decided that they issued a guideline to all federal agencies refusing to allow homosexuality as a rationale for not hiring or for firing an individual. So in the 1960s, early 1970s, there was a real focus on employment rights within the US federal government system. And of course, what happened in the federal government's employment had a knock-on effect within corporate America as well. We then come to the Stonewall riots. You've heard of the Stonewall riots? A very, very famous set of riots. In June '69, there was a police raid on the Stonewall Inn in New York. The police attempted to arrest some customers. It led to what CNN would today call mostly peaceful protests. Now, the context in America in the 1960s was that America had a lot of riots, particularly in the African American community. In the civil rights movement, you had the Watts riots in '65, Cleveland in 1966, Detroit in '67, New York in '64. And so the civil rights movement had the peaceful wing led by Martin Luther King, who argued that we should appeal, you might say, to the better angels of American society or to the conscience of American society. And there was also a more militant wing of the civil rights movement. And some gay rights activists said, well, if we just appeal to the better angels of American society, we're never going to get anywhere. Therefore, we need to take our fight to the streets. And so the gay rights movement started to echo some of the slogans, the logos of the civil rights movements. And I've given you some of the examples up there on the screen. So in the 1970s, we move into zapping. Do any of you remember zapping? You being zapped by somebody? Okay, zapping was kind of in-your-face protesting. That was when if somebody didn't like a preacher, they didn't like a politician, they didn't like a judge, they didn't like a trade union leader, then there would be a group of gay rights activists who would kind of zap you. That means they'd stand outside your home when they'd shout slogans at you and they'd wave banners in your face and so forth. And it was very much getting in-your-face kind of protests. And meanwhile, at the same time as the zapping took over, the lesbian movement became more radical as well. The lesbians were very upset because they basically argued that every time we have a gay rights movement, it's dominated by the men in the room. That there's no voice for the women in the room. It's always the male homosexuals driving the conversation, but the females, nobody's listening to them. The other issue that the lesbians had was that in the 1960s and 70s, when men were cross-dressing transvestitism, they dressed in a way that the lesbians argued emphasized the very characteristics and features of women that they didn't want to be emphasized. So like the men would walk around in high heels, short skirts, and heavy red makeup on, okay, lipstick. And the lesbians were saying, that's kind of a mockery of what it means to be a woman, and it's demeaning to us women, and you men who cross-dress as women, you're not doing the women any favors in the process. I think there was some truth to that, actually. And so the lesbians kind of took a more radical direction, and they started to talk about being male-identified or women-identified in their heads. And that's one of the kind of the origins of the transgender movement in some small way there. You had Rita Mae Brown and Charlotte Brown. They led what were known as the Furies in the 1970s. And they established a lesbian commune in D.C. committed to radical feminism as a political choice and a choice to escape male domination. And so heterosexuality, according to lesbians, it fed a world of male dominance. So lesbianism wasn't so much a sexual orientation, but a conscious choice to reject imperialism, capitalism, sexism, and racism, all of which was to be replaced by the panacea of socialism. And the Furies actually inspired a whole series of lesbian collectives across the United States. And they saw homosexual men as just as much a problem as heterosexual men, and the solution was to be a feminist lesbian and to build an all-women's world without men. And that didn't get very far for, well, obvious reasons. In the 1970s, you also had the question of which women's voices are we listening to, because 1960s second-wave feminism was mostly comprised of middle-class white ladies in the Manhattan area, or Chicago or Los Angeles. And there were many African-American ladies who were saying, well, actually, when the middle-class white women speak about women's problems, they have no idea what the African-American women are going through. And so you start to see in the 1970s collectives being formed and more writers, women, African-American writers, talking about their experience of life in the United States. And so there was a collective formed, an African-American lesbian feminist collective was formed called the Combahee River Collective in 1974. And they had some very famous leaders, Shirlene McRae, Audre Lorde, Gloria Hull, Cheryl Clark, and Barbara Smith. And they wrote what we now call the Combahee River Collective Statement, calling for the destruction of capitalism, imperialism, and patriarchy. Now, some of you probably know McRae, because when she left that lesbian collective, she moved to New York and she married Bill de Blasio, the current mayor of New York City. Okay, so before she married him, in a heterosexual marriage, she was one of the leaders of this lesbian feminist collective, the Combahee River Collective, in the mid-1970s. Bill de Blasio, of course, was a supporter of the communists of Nicaragua, the Sandinistas, and they married in 1994, so that's kind of like a modern-day player, shall we say, from history. So the first time we come to activism in Congress was, and I have here a copy of the Equality Act. This is the Equality Act here. And the first version of the Equality Act was brought before Congress in 1974 by Ed, what do you pronounce his name, Koch or Coach? Koch. Okay, I wasn't here in America at the time. He was the mayor of New York, I think, or something. Yeah? Ed Koch? All right, okay. So he sought to ban, in the Equality Act of 74, discrimination on the grounds of sexual or affectional preference. He didn't have the word homosexual written in the act because it was too politically explosive. But the 1974 Equality Act never made it out of the Senate committee. But activism in the late 70s was now transitioning to political decision makers in Washington. Parallel to this, there was an effort to reshape how the psychiatric profession understood the question of homosexuality. So what we see is that the gay rights movement first of all targeted the pastors in the Bay Area in the 1960s. They then start targeting Congress in the 1970s, and they also start, and they've been dealing with the police in the 60s with the Pride marches, and in the 1970s there's a focus on the American Psychiatric Association. So every year the American Psychiatric Association holds a convention, and in 1971 that was held in Washington, D.C. And it descended into chaos in this lovely big hotel when it was zapped by thousands of gay rights activists. The hotel was just flooded with gay rights activists. They took over the stage, they took the microphone. It wasn't violent, it was relatively peaceful in all seriousness. People would sit on the platform and they'd take the microphone and chant some slogans and so forth. And they did this, so the 1971 American Psychiatric Association convention descended into chaos. Nothing could happen. And so the Kameny was part of this, Gittings was part of this, the famous lesbian campaigner. And so they accused the psychiatrists of declaring homosexuality to be a pathology, not because of any clinical evidence, but because they were personally uncomfortable with homosexuality. So the doctors, he argued, Kameny was saying that to be homosexual is not a clinical condition that you should diagnose and treat as an illness, but you just don't like it personally. That's why you're treating us the way you are. And so there was a lot of discussions held between the American Psychiatric Association and the gay rights movement. And in 72, the next APA conference featured a presentation with a guy called Dr. H. Anonymous, who was actually a gay psychiatrist. Along with Kameny and Barbara Gittings, they held a panel discussion, and they challenged the traditional views of the American psychiatrists. Now that guy, Dr. H. Anonymous, have you ever seen, you know when hackers have these white Joker masks? Yes? He wore one of those masks, so nobody could tell exactly who it was. And there are some very famous pictures of the psychiatrist with the Joker mask sitting at the front of the APA annual conference. Well, what happened was the American Psychiatric Association decided to change how they understood homosexuality, not on the basis of any clinical data, either for or against their understanding. They just decided to replace the word homosexual with sexual orientation disturbance. And psychiatrists, they sought to keep in harmony with the changing zeitgeist, like how did society view this situation. And they said it's not normal, it's just not abnormal, which is kind of like an unfortunate gray zone to be in. You know, you're not normal, but you're not abnormal. It's a very hard place to be, you know, if the psychiatrists are talking about you in that way. And so this raised questions, and every society has to wrestle with this. How do you know when somebody's mad? And how do you know when somebody's bad? And how do you know when somebody's normal? These are hard questions. It's very, very hard to make a clear-cut judgment on that, because every society has a different bell curve of what they consider to be normal. So if you go and live, let's say for arguments in South Africa, any of you go and live in South Africa, and you start acting what your family think you're going crazy, you may go and see a South African psychologist or psychiatrist, and you have to treat that with extreme caution, because people in Africa or in Asia have different bell curves of what is considered normal or abnormal. And so it's not a very helpful diagnosis to have from a foreign psychiatrist. You really want a psychiatrist from your own culture who understands what are the drivers and what are the concepts of mental illness, mental health within your own society. So the zapping of the psychiatrists was basically like playing chicken with the psychiatrist and saying, look, on what basis do you say that something is mental illness? What is your clinical basis for that? Is it just societal prejudice? Is it what you personally think? Or is this something that you can show from clinical research? But by 1974, the DSM-2, the next edition of the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, had eliminated all references to homosexuality completely. We then come to the 80s. We're moving forward in time, and maybe some of you remember this, the HIV/AIDS pandemic. Some of you are old enough to remember the HIV/AIDS pandemic. It was an absolute tragedy. The first 5 cases in October 80, May 81, the CDC's Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report in June 1981 reports on 5 healthy young men with a rare illness previously seen only among patients with severe immunosuppression. By the time the report was published, 2 of those 5 young men had already passed away. And so what happened in America and in other parts of the world was that the HIV/AIDS pandemic was viewed as a gay cancer. And the popular media emphasized the promiscuity in the same-sex community rather than the fact that many of them were victims. And so the New York Times published an article, I'm quoting there, as many as 10 sexual encounters each night up to 4 times a week, emphasizing the promiscuity, and by implication, it's these guys' fault that they're dying out. That was kind of the implication of the New York Times article there in the early 1980s. The New York Times clearly has changed a lot since then. Well, AIDS cases skyrocketed in America. They skyrocketed nationwide and across the rest of the world. And so the civil rights movement had the first march on Washington in the mid-1960s. So there was the second march on Washington in 1987. And this was a march for a whole variety of reasons. They wanted to put pressure on politicians to put money into research for pharmaceuticals to help people not die of AIDS. They were also protesting the violence on the streets, because during the AIDS pandemic, there was a lot of violence against young men and women in the gay districts of America. And they also wanted to commemorate the 40,000 plus victims who'd already died. And if you Google it, type in the AIDS quilt along the Washington Mall. It was a very impressive thing. People brought along a 3-foot by 6-foot handmade panel, each representing a loved one who died of AIDS. And they filled up the Washington Mall from end to end. And maybe some of you remember those pictures. If you don't remember those pictures, do a Google search. It was a very poignant reminder that the AIDS pandemic isn't just, these people aren't just numbers, but these are real people, these are real parents grieving their lost sons and daughters, and there was a lot of pain out there. So there was a lot of pressure on Congress to act, there was a lot of pressure on big pharma companies to act, and as a result of that, there was much research and development done, and in 96, protease inhibitors were made available across the states, and deaths from AIDS in large US cities dropped by as much as 50% very, very rapidly. And today, people don't say that I have AIDS, they say that I'm living with AIDS. That is, now it's a very manageable condition. That if you're diagnosed with HIV/AIDS, it's not a death sentence. You can actually live a productive, fruitful life with AIDS because of the various medications that are now available. And that's a huge advance from where it was before. I've spent quite a bit of time in Africa. And what happens is when people start becoming physically active in parts of Africa about the age of like 12, 13, they've generally got AIDS by the time they're like 16. AIDS doesn't kill them until they're about 25, okay? So what you have is, by the time they're 25, they've had their own children. And so what you're left with is the 20s and 30-year-olds are all dead of AIDS, and what you're left with is the grandparents and the children. You have this hollowing out of society. And many of those children had no choice in when they became physically active. It's been a real scourge across many parts of Africa, Zambia, parts of South Africa, KwaZulu-Natal, Zimbabwe. The AIDS pandemic was an absolute tragedy that hit many, many people, and many young children got caught up in it, and they paid the consequences. And most of that was not their fault. They were pressured into doing things. And so the gay rights movement in America, in pressuring Big Pharma and Congress to act in this area, actually helped a lot of other people around the world by virtue of these drugs now becoming widely available. So some modern day advances. In 1993, Don't Ask, Don't Tell went into effect. Do any of you remember Don't Ask, Don't Tell? It was an interesting thing because Clinton was under pressure from the gay rights movement to allow open homosexuality within the military. He did research with the military, and they said, we don't want it. So the Don't Ask, Don't Tell was kind of a compromise, like if you don't ask, we don't tell, which means that you can serve in the military and you're not going to be dishonorably discharged unless you're kind of flamboyant. In 2009, President Obama, and Obama was really the key president in the sexual revolution in America. Obama did more than anybody else for the sexual revolution. Whether that's good or bad, you can come to your own conclusion, but one of the things he first signed was the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act. Now, again, because we have minors present here tonight, we won't go into the details, but what happened to Matthew Shepard and James Byrd should happen to no human being ever at any time in human history. What happened to them was profoundly terrible. And so he signed the Hate Crimes Prevention Act into law in 2009. And regardless of the morality of what we're talking about, what those young men put up with and how they died is a shame on any nation. It was terrible. You cannot be a person of good conscience and say they deserved it. No, it was a terrible, terrible thing. And so President Obama signed the Hate Crimes Prevention Act into law in 2009. In 2010, he signed the law repealing DADT, Don't Ask, Don't Tell. There was a lot of concerted pressure in the American media. The gay rights movement was pressuring him. Kameny had like an open-door access to President Obama's office. They knew each other very well. And in 2014, Obama amended Clinton's earlier executive order prohibiting discrimination based on gender identity, and he amended Johnson's executive order so this community could not be discriminated against by federal contractors. And so Obama in 2014 was moving beyond sexual orientation to questions of gender identity because Obama was at the front of the transgender issue as well. In 2015, Obergefell versus Hodges, that was a very famous Supreme Court decision, ruled 5-4 in favor. It was Justice Anthony Kennedy. He cemented his place as the hero of the liberal Americans, of the liberal America. He argued that the 14th Amendment, the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, meant that same-sex marriages had the same legal recognition as opposite-sex marriages, and that was what came into law in 2015. So where we are now is H.R. 5. Have you all heard of H.R. 5, the Equality Act? All right, H.R. 5 is, the first Equality Act was put before Congress in the mid-1970s and didn't get out of Senate committee. H.R. 5 has already been passed by the House. The only thing that stops H.R. 5 from being voted is the filibuster in the Senate. And the filibuster is under target in the next couple of months. You've already seen the tweets going out about it. So what does the Equality Act do? Well, the Equality Act is a very interesting thing. The Act, it says, it is to prohibit discrimination on the basis of sex, gender identity, and sexual orientation, and for other purposes. So for the first time in American legal history, the Equality Act is an act of Congress that says that your biological sex and your gender identity are not the same thing. It's buying into critical gender theory. It says that your gender is a social construct. So critical theory, whether it's critical race, critical gender theory, LGBTQ studies, argues that like race is a social construct and gender is a social construct. And so the HR 5, it legally separates your biological sex, male or female, from your gender identity, which could be man, woman, two-spirit. There's like 60 or 70 of them out there right now. The list is growing by the week, it seems. And so what this does is it says that you cannot discriminate. It goes through all the existing laws, and it goes through chapter and verse and says this is repealed, and this is repealed, and this no longer stands. And it covers housing, access to student loans, a whole variety of things. Now, the Equality Act may seem like it's an innocuous piece of legislation, because the Civil Rights Act prohibits discrimination on the basis of, let's say, sex or race or national origin. But this amends the Civil Rights Act to include, say, you cannot discriminate on the grounds of sexual orientation or gender identity. Now, it goes much further than you would think, because it doesn't limit what kind of sexual orientation you cannot discriminate on. It just says, all sexual orientation. And if your sexual orientation is defined as your exclusive attraction towards X, Y, or Z, which is that's the rough description of one's orientation, that means that we're not just talking about LGBTQ here. We're talking about every other thing in the alphabet as well. If I have an exclusive attraction to trees, which some people do have, ecosexuals, then that must be recognized and cannot be discriminated against. And so the law presents America with basically a whole new framework of morality. Section 1107 in here, as far as churches are concerned, this is very interesting because in the Obergefell versus Hodges case, the Supreme Court Justice recognized that they were setting up a clash. Does religious freedom trump your sexual orientation, or does your sexual orientation override your religious conscience? And they didn't clarify that question in the Obergefell versus Hodges. That was the same-sex marriage case in 2015. But in this Equality Act, it says the Religious Freedom Restoration Act of 93, that basically encodes the First Amendment religious freedom rights under the Constitution into civil law. That was signed by Clinton. So the RFRA, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, shall not provide a claim concerning or a defense to a claim under a covered title, that is sexual orientation or gender identity, or provide a basis for challenging the application or enforcement of a covered title. Now, what does that mean? It means that your religious freedom's gone forever. Because that means that if there is ever a clash between your freedom of conscience or what the church teaches or the Bible teaches and what somebody says that they have or they are, then you must accept what they have or what they are over and above what you may believe from Scripture to be true or right or moral. This is saying that if, at the moment, under the separation of church and state, the US government does not interfere in the employment decisions of the Upper Columbia Conference, because that would be an interference between church and state. What that means, say for pastors, is that pastors have no legal protections in America. You're aware of that, yes? Because the pastor is not covered by the, for instance, the Americans with Disability Act. You can't claim protection under that if you're a pastor, because the employment issue of how churches operate is completely separate from how the state provides employment framework for everybody else. That decision was made in 2012 in the Hosanna Tabor versus Lutheran case in the Supreme Court. And that's where pastors have what's called a ministerial exemption. They're salaried and they're a ministerial exemption. So basically, pastors have no legal protections. Whereas this act here, the Equality Act, says that you can't use your First Amendment rights to provide a defense against not hiring, let's say, a man with, say, minor attraction. Minor attraction is pedophilia. It's just the more polite word for it. You cannot use your First Amendment rights as a conference to provide a legal basis for not hiring someone who has genetic sexual attraction. That's a fancy word for incest. And so if I am in a physical relationship with, say, my brother, my twin brother, and I want to be a pastor, The fact that I'm in that physical relationship could not be used by the church to say, no, we can't hire you as a pastor. It also means that if a man is a self-proclaimed minor attracted person, otherwise known as a pedophile, the conference could not hire them on that basis. So the Equality Act, it's talking about every orientation, not just a select few. And it basically says that whatever your orientation is, everybody must accept it, no matter what their civil, legal, or religious objections to it. And so that's what this little paragraph here has profound implications for America. It means that, Upper Columbia Conference, as it is now, if I'm married to a wife, she's a biological female, and if I were to come out tomorrow and say, hey, I'm now gay, and I'm going to move in with this guy down the road, the conference could fire me immediately. They'd be within their rights to do it as a religious employer. If this gets passed, they would try it, but I would fight the dismissal on the grounds of the Equality Act. You can't discriminate against my sexual orientation. And so what's going to happen is, if this gets passed, as night follows day that every conference is going to get sued, because conferences are a sitting duck target. And every conference in America, about 15 years ago, we used to have, do you remember the association and then the conference, yes? You'd have the Upper Columbia Conference Association, and then you had the conference. And the association legally owned all the property, but the conference legally did all the employment, and they were separate legal entities. And about 15 years ago, what we did in North America, across our division, we merged the associations with the conferences into one legal entity. Why did we do that? Because when we were being sued by somebody, they sued two defendants, and that was double the damages. So we halved our liability and exposure as a church by merging our conferences and associations, which now means that our employment decisions are made by the same entity that owns all the property. Do you see the vulnerability there? So we're going to sue you on an employment issue, knowing full well that that entity owns all the property in the conference. That means you've got money. And we can sue you, and you'll have to sell off a bunch of properties to pay off your damages. So we are extremely vulnerable. Many churches are in the same position. In Britain, the Methodist Church and the Baptists have realized that this is a real problem, and they've actually been saying to each church, you must become a separate legal entity, and you hold your own property, but we'll do all the employment from the central conference. These are the Methodists and the Baptists doing it. And they're doing that as a defensive posture, so that if you sue me over employment issues, you can't get your hands on the church properties. Now, we're not there yet in North America, but this isn't too far away. And the only thing that's stopping this from happening is the filibuster. And there are two senators who are stopping the filibuster from being taken away. Kirsten Sinema from Arizona and Doug Manchin from West Virginia. And it only takes those two to change their minds, and America will change radically as soon as the Equality Act gets passed, because our current president has promised he will sign this as soon as he possibly can. So if the Equality Act gets passed, and sexual orientation, and this is any sexual orientation, it doesn't limit it, it's any sexual orientation, cannot legally be challenged or discriminated against. And the basic premise of the gay rights movement is that government cannot and should not legislate for any particular version of morality. That means we as American society will have to accept and normalize minor attracted persons, that's pedophilia, genetic sexual attraction, that is incestuous relationships, zoophilia, otherwise known as bestiality, necrophilia, which is making out with corpses in the funeral home, multiple partner, same family, marriage, etc. And you may say, oh, that's not going to happen, Pastor Vine. Oh, yes, it is. It's already happening. There's a case in New York right now. We don't know whether it's a mother and her daughter or a father and his son, but they claim that their orientation is this. And they're saying that there's no possible offspring from this relationship because they're the same biological sex. They're suing in New York for the right to marry. And no, New York, it'll probably get through. Now you may say, well, how does that affect society? Well, let me just give you a simple example. Does anybody here want to pay inheritance tax? No? So just before you die, marry one of your offspring, because then they become your spouse, and spouses do not pay inheritance tax, do they? No. You know, if I die, my wife inherits everything with no tax. So if I marry my son just before I die, that means he inherits everything, and we eliminate inheritance tax at a stroke. So same-sex genetic sexual attraction, incestuous marriage, becomes a smart tax move if this goes through in New York. So this is the impact of the Equality Act, and if we have to normalize this in American society, or we have to normalize this, you're really looking at like the complete dissolution of the family unit. And almost anything is possible, and nothing is beyond legal bounds anymore. So this is the impact of the Equality Act. And this was raised a couple of years ago. They were debating the Equality Act a couple of years ago. One of the members of Congress raised this question and said, well, aren't we going to limit the types of sexual orientation? Because when we talk about LGBT, or LGB, because that's really the orientation, T is not an orientation, it's a gender identity issue, but LGB, why don't we just limit it to LGB? And the answer was no, we're not going to limit this at all. It'll be all sexual orientations, and they will now be legally permissible, and you cannot discriminate against them. So this represents the absolute triumph of a worldview that says there is no form of morality other than what I want to do, and you must accept whatever I want to do regardless of what you may think about it. And if you don't accept it, even if you're a church, we will sue you out of existence. So this is American society. If this gets passed by Congress, and there's 2 senators holding this up because they won't give in on the filibuster, but if the filibuster goes this fall, and there's already making noise, they want to get rid of it, then this is going to happen very, very quickly in American society. There are some current, in terms of the gay rights movement, affecting Adventists right now. A couple of months ago, it was about 3 months ago, a group of current and former LGBTQ students, they've sued the Department of Education to force their colleges, universities, and seminaries to change their policies towards the LGBTQ community or stop providing federal financial assistance to the students. The case, you can look it up, is known as Hunter versus U.S. Department of Education, and it was filed in federal court in Oregon, surprise, surprise, because it will go to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, which is almost guaranteed to go through with this. And it argues that by refusing to enforce non-discrimination provisions against religious colleges, LGBTQ students are condemned to a life of loneliness and institutionalized shame and fear on these college campuses. Now take a look at the college campuses that are being sued. Baylor was what denomination? The Southern Baptist. Brigham Young is? Indiana Wesleyan is? Fuller Theological is? Evangelical. Liberty as evangelical, and Adventist. We're one of the named defendants in that lawsuit. What are they doing? This lawsuit targets one college from every major denomination. So we're going to get you all together in one lawsuit. And we're going to sue, and the impact of this is this: if they win this, they will then be able to say to colleges, unless there's the full acceptance and indeed promotion of the LGBTQ agenda on your campus, then the Department of Education will refuse to issue student loans to students at your facility. Now, if student loans stop flowing to La Sierra from the federal government tomorrow, La Sierra will close the day after. So we've reached that point in American society where the rubber is meeting the road right as we speak. This case is now going through. At first, the current administration said they were going to rigorously defend the colleges. Then there was pressure. Then they now say they're going to adequately defend. But this is a bit like the Obama administration with the Defense of Marriage Act. They initially said they would defend it. Then they pulled back, and eventually they said we're not going to defend it at all, the Defense of Marriage Act. So nobody knows how this is going to go. But this is a lawsuit that's happening right now. There's another lawsuit right now with Fuller Theological Seminary. It came in about 2 months ago, and that will directly affect all of our colleges depending on which way that lawsuit goes. So our colleges are being targeted in very specific lawsuits, and we have an administration in office that really has no interest in defending those colleges or their religious convictions. So our colleges, all of them, and all these are Protestant colleges, are all living on borrowed time, you might say. Sooner or later, one of these cases is going to win. It's only a matter of time. At which point, we have to choose as an Adventist church, do we keep our colleges open and essentially have them have pride marches every year and Gay Pride Month and fully promoting this lifestyle, or do we close our colleges? And I'm not going to be in any committee that makes those decisions, but I suspect we're going to keep them open. So, competing worldviews. If we look at the biblical worldview and the sexual revolution here. So civil law, as Christians, we argue that civil statutes define crime, they deal with crime, and civil statutes do not deal with sin or morality. And to break a civil law is an incivility. Now, this is good news. Why is this good news? Because when I put my foot down on the accelerator and I break the speed limit, my wife says, that's immoral. I say, no, it's only an incivility. It's not a moral issue. It's a civil infraction, but it's not a moral issue. You can't make a moral judgment because I'm doing 35 in a 25-mile-an-hour speed zone. All right, but so civil statutes define crime, but they don't define morality. And the sexual revolution actually argues exactly the same thing. When it comes to divine law, such as the Ten Commandments, we argue as Christians from a biblical worldview that divine statutes define and deal with sin. So to break moral rules is immoral. So for instance, the seventh commandment says, thou shalt not commit adultery, but there is no civil law against adultery, is there? There's no civil law against adultery, but there is in the seventh commandment. So God's law, the Ten Commandments, deals with moral issues, and civil laws deal with civil infractions. And so to break a moral law is not an incivility, it is an immoral act for which we're accountable before our Heavenly Father. In the sexual revolution, however, they say there is no God, there's no revealed morality, there is no divine law, nor a final judgment. Remember the Council on Religion in the Bay Area of the 1960s? They said that love is the only norm of conduct. Remember that principle that they were talking about? So basically, whoever I want to hook up with tonight, that's moral, period. There's no moral restriction, there's no external framework that says X or Y is sinful or okay. Whatever I want to do, whenever I want to do it, wherever I want to do it, with whomever I want to do it, that must be moral. There is no more revealed morality in the sexual revolution. In the biblical worldview, we assume there's a separation of church and state. We'll talk a bit more about that tomorrow. In the sexual revolution, there is no separation of church and state because there is no place for the church. The state alone is supreme and has supreme power. And so the role of the church in the biblical worldview, because we accept the role of the church, is we're entrusted by God with the gospel and the Holy Spirit to promote what the Apostle Paul calls the obedience of faith, Romans 1 and Romans 15, and to guide individuals to morality. That is what God asks of us as Christians. But in the sexual revolution, the church is merely a social actor or an ally, and we should theoretically exist to promote the civil rights of this community, but we are not called to promote biblical or revealed morality. So a liberal pastor may march on a gay pride event in a pride march, but the pride marchers have no time for the Christian morality that pastor represents. They just see him as an ally of convenience, that he lends credibility to their cause, but they don't actually accept that the Bible has anything to say to us today. So from a biblical worldview, we live within and are accountable to a revealed moral framework from God. And, my kids, when they were small, they'd sit in the back of the car and they'd sing, trust and obey, for there's no other way to be happy in marriage but trust and obey. They said, Dad, listen to your wife, listen to Mum, and if you trust and obey, you'll be happy in marriage. So you're accountable to your wife, Dad, you're accountable to Mum here. But we believe as Christians that we are all accountable to God for how we treat our neighbor. Okay? We are accountable. By their words and by their deeds shall you be judged. So we are accountable to God for how we treat our neighbor. In the sexual revolution, there is no revealed moral framework, and there's no more accountability to God because God does not exist. So each individual is their own little God. They are sovereign, and they seek happiness as he or she chooses. It's a nihilist worldview. So in the sexual revolution, anybody who places any kind of restriction on what I want to do in seeking personal happiness is viewed as being an oppressor, that you're stopping me finding fulfillment, you're stopping me finding happiness, which is why the church is now viewed as the oppressor in modern-day American society, because we are stopping people finding their own way to personal happiness. In terms of civil authorities and morality, we argue as Adventists that for a separation of church and state, and the civil authorities should not legislate for morality. This is what A.T. Jones argued for in the 1880s before the Senate with the Blair Bill in the 1880s. Senator Jones argued this. He said, "It is not Congress's job to impose a particular view of morality on American society." And he won those arguments in the 1880s. Now, the gay rights movement makes the same argument. They say it is not Congress's role to impose a certain form of morality on American society. So ostensibly, they have exactly the same argument. The difference is that Jones was working on the assumption that Congress still had a biblical worldview. Kameny and the gay rights movement say that there is no God, there is no external moral framework, therefore Congress should not impose any framework on society because it's up to each individual to do as they please, and nobody can say what's right or wrong anymore. So it's actually, they're coming from philosophically very, very different positions. In the sexual revolution, their understanding of civil authorities and morality is that civil authorities should not legislate for morality. That's what A.T. Jones was arguing. But actually, in the sexual revolution, they are imposing the sexual revolution on everybody else via the cancel culture. That even though they say that society should not impose a view on everybody else, that is, society shouldn't impose a view on us, they're quite happy to impose their view on everybody else, which is what the Equality Act is all about. Okay? This is the triumph of the LGBTQ movement, that we're going to force everybody to bow to our ideology. And actually, the LGBTQ ideology is actually, it's not a community, it's a group of competing groups who are at war with each other. They're at war with each other. Just to give you an example, the L's and the G's argue that for instance, a homosexual is a man who is attracted to a biological male. Biological male attracted to biological male, that means gay. B is G is a biological male to a biological male. L is biological female to biological female, but the T's argue, no. Your biological sex is immaterial. Your gender identity is not attached to your biological sex, and so a biological male who is not attracted to a biological female who claims to be a man is now guilty of transphobia and is guilty of a hate crime. And a biological female who's a lesbian who refuses to hook up with a biological male who claims to be a trans woman, she's also guilty of transphobia and guilty of a hate crime. And so the T's are now triumphing over the L's and the G's. They're at war with each other. And the term of abuse that is used is TERF. You heard the phrase TERF? A trans exclusionary reactionary feminist. So TERFs are women who believe that to be a woman means you are a biological woman. And that is now considered hate speech by the transgender community. And when you have pride parades now, you regularly see Trans Lives Matters beating up the L's and the G's in the parades because they don't subscribe to T ideology. So the thing is getting very, very confusing. And even yesterday, the heroes of yesterday are being in the L and the G community are being cancelled by the T community because they haven't kept up with the ever-changing ideology. So even though the sexual revolution says that there should be no imposed framework, they're quite happy to impose their framework on everybody else. And they're quite happy to impose their framework within their own broader community there. So what do we say in conclusion? Well, the arguments used by the gay rights activists, such as Kameny, who died just a few years ago, they're ostensibly similar to those used by A.T. Jones. That is, Congress should not be imposing a moral framework upon society. And we would say, if we were just to stop there, we would agree with what they were saying. However, the West as the West has progressively abandoned Scripture and become ever more secular, so the sexual revolution, in direct correlation to that, has advanced culturally, socially, politically, and legally. And so the sexual revolution is essentially the new religion of America. Our corporate religion, our government religion, our media religion, and so forth. And in our brave new secular culture, what does it mean to be a good person? You become an ally of one of the minority groups in the pyramid of oppression. And so I'm a white, straight, heterosexual, cisgender male. That's where I am in the pyramid. That means I'm guilty of all the evil of human history, allegedly. But how can I deviate from that evil? I simply say, oh, I'm an ally of the B's, or I'm an ally of the T's. Allyship. You heard of allyship? You become an ally. That means that I vocally promote the legal and social aims of that group, and the more vocal, the more noisy, the more in your face I'm about it, the more I deflect from my own guilt. This is a form of emotional manipulation, psychological manipulation. It's like Stockholm Syndrome on a massive scale. So many of the young people marching in, say, the BLM marches were not African Americans, but they are young white college kids who are working off their historical guilt by being vocal allies. Okay? I'm not arguing for BLM for or against it. I'm just saying that this is a factor that people are emotionally manipulated in college, and it's mostly in college, that how can I work off my guilt? I become an ally, and the more extreme of an ally I become, the more virtuous I appear before today's mob or on Twitter, because that's the judge of morality these days. So if sexual orientation under the Equality Act cannot legally be challenged, and this is any sexual orientation or any gender identity, and the basic premise of the gay rights movement is that government cannot and should not legislate for any particular version of morality, then if this thing passes this fall in the US Congress, we will have to accept and normalize in our American society all of those things I've listed up there, and other things will come as well. That's what will now be protected classes in American law, because it's any sexual attraction, not just L or G or T, or LG or B, it's anything. And this has been articulated in Congress. People understand the implications of this, and if the filibuster falls, we in America will face a radical change in our society almost overnight. And Christians will be hunted down to be sued so we can be stripped of our churches and our schools and our colleges and our lands and everything. We will be targeted unless we bow the knee to the new ideology. So this is what's happening in America today. So in a 1994 interview, Jeffrey Dahmer, you're familiar with Jeffrey Dahmer? He was not a vegan, was he? Well, some of you were laughing, but he wasn't a vegan. Now, I'm a strictly vegan between meals, but he wasn't a vegan when he ate either. So just before he died, he was in prison, and he did an interview, and you can look for this on YouTube. The video is up there. I mean, it's an amazing video. He was interviewed. It was like something like 60 minutes or something. Or somebody did an interview with him, and they wanted to know why he did what he did. And Jeffrey Dahmer, everybody portrays him as being mad and bad, but actually he was sane and he was highly articulate. And he understood philosophically the rationale for what he did. And he says this is a quote, word for word. He says, "I always believed the lie that the theory of evolution is truth, that we all came from the slime, and when we die, that is it." He's been taught evolution in school. Now, if a person does not believe that there is a God that we're accountable to, then what's the point of trying to modify your behavior to keep it within acceptable ranges? He essentially argues that every society has a bell curve of normal behavior, but each society has a slightly different bell curve. And how does that bell curve shift? The bell curve shifts when people at the edges are pushing the boundaries out. So why can't you push the boundaries out if there's no moral accountability? Jeffrey Dahmer was no idiot. He wasn't a vegan, but he wasn't an idiot. He understood philosophically that this is what's happening in America today with our abandonment of God, the adoption of a secular worldview, and the idea of not absolute morality, but relative morality, where you do what is right for you and you have your truth in life, as Oprah Winfrey calls it, that there is no point in trying to modify your behavior, because if enough people do it, it will become normal. So you might as well keep doing it. So without the biblical worldview in America, there is no longer sin in American popular culture. And the only sin remaining in America today, the most grievous sin of all, is for Christians to impose their bigoted biblical worldview and moral framework on others, which is why we see such hostility against Christianity in our government, in our public institutions. No society in human history, however, has ever survived with a popular culture that refuses all moral restraint. A society that says there is no moral restraint. Every man can do in his own eyes whatever he wishes. God is in his own eyes. Every man is king in his own eyes. Well, no society has ever survived. And without a revealed morality, that is an externally revealed morality, such as the scripture, that places, I haven't called it here restrictions on behavior, but protections of holiness on behavior. Without a revealed morality that places protections of holiness on our behavior, on our attitudes and our social mores or our social behaviors, any society will inevitably degrade to the point of collapse at immense human cost. And America I've been here for 15 years, and in those 15 years, America has changed radically and not in a good way. Our society is fraying at the edges. We are falling apart because we have these competing worldviews, and these worldviews are fundamentally incompatible. They cannot survive side by side. We're either going to have one worldview that places protections of holiness, that places limits on us all, or we have another worldview that says there are no restrictions, and we're going to destroy those who believe that there should be restrictions, and the net result of that is social collapse. And that is where we are right now in America. So when we talk about religious liberty used to be a virtue in America up until about the 1970s. And now the case of religious liberty has been turned around, like people, I won't mention politician's name, but one was saying recently, like, you can't use your religious liberty as a cover for bigotry. So therefore you have to get rid of your religious liberty, because that's the umbrella under which bigotry takes place. So this is where we are in America right now. And this is why religious liberty is, for Christians, an ever more important topic. Now, tomorrow afternoon we'll be talking about religious liberty and COVID and vaccine mandates and so forth, but I've talked about this here tonight because this is where we've come as an American society. And it's not any of our individual fault. This is just where we are right now as America. And our current administration promised that in their first 100 days they would pass this. In fact, this was promised to be the first bill signed by the current administration. It never happened, but this is still a legislative priority for the current administration. I'm not criticizing the current administration, I'm simply describing, and you can come to your own conclusions whether you think that's a bad or a good thing. But if you have children, or if you have grandchildren, or if one day you'd like to have children, or if one day you'd like to have grandchildren, it's probably not a good prospect for those children to be raised in a society that normalizes the sexual engagement with children, because that's where this is going. So as Christians, we weep in compassion as Jesus did over the city of Jerusalem. We weep over the New Jerusalem, as you might say, America today, because our nation is hurtling towards willful self-destruction. And the inevitable consequence of the new worldview that has been adopted, and it's not Democrats, it's everybody in Washington pretty much has adopted this worldview. It's across the board. Our nation is hurtling towards willful self-destruction. So we all need to ask ourselves, where do we stand? What are our red lines? What do we stand for? What do we stand against? And however we stand, we do it as Jesus taught us to pray for those who persecute us and bless those who despitefully use us. Because if we have an attitude of hatred towards those who may persecute us, how are they going to see Jesus? So whatever else happens, we are to maintain a Christ-like attitude if our schools are closed, if our conferences are sued out of existence, if our pastors are all forced out of employment, etc., etc., etc. If one day we may have to go to an underground church, so be it. But the underground, the underground church, we say, oh, that's a terrible thing. Well, underground churches have never done badly in history. Underground churches have grown in history. The greater the persecution, the greater the growth. So it's not a tragedy. It's nice to sit in a church like this. One day we won't be able to. But that doesn't mean that the church stops to function. Church simply meets where people are, in their homes, in the park, at a workplace, around a cafeteria table. That's where church continues to meet. So that's where we are as America today. That's why religious liberty is an important ministry today. And I would encourage you, don't bury your head in the sand. Start reading about these topics, understand the language that's being used, understand how language is being changed before our very eyes, and recognize that the confusion that is out there is profound. Just to give you an example, AOC did an interview 2 nights ago on the Texas abortion law. Did any of you see that interview? Well, she was saying this is a war on women. To which the obvious question goes, but you've been saying that men can have children. She's pro-transgender ideology. So if men can have children, then how is this a war on women? You don't know the gender of anybody that has a child, do you? You're assuming it. You're assuming they're all female. But you don't know that for certain. So she changed her language towards menstruating persons. This is a war on menstruating persons, and the logical response to that is if you're menstruating, you're not pregnant, you can't have an abortion. So even within that interview 2 nights ago, you see the confusion that's now inherent within these shifting ideologies. How can the Texas law, the abortion law, how can you say it's a war by men on women? You're assuming the gender of the Texas legislatures, and you're assuming the gender of those who have children, and both of which are things you've been saying we can't do. So you don't know. You don't know if it's a war on women. You just say it's a war by an unknown group on an unknown group. So what we see today is just societal confusion. It's confusion. It's like Babylon. And we're a nation divided on itself, morally and spiritually. We've rejected God, and we are starting to reap a horrendous harvest. So we're going to come back tomorrow. We'll talk about some more things. Tomorrow morning, we're going to talk about how the Adventist Church has responded to totalitarianism in the past, how we can respond. I'm not going to talk about the underground church. I spoke about that 4 weeks ago. We'll talk about some other ways that we can respond. And so that'll be for Sabbath school tomorrow. We'll be talking about COVID and conscience at 2 o'clock tomorrow as well. Okay? So, yes, I'm proud of being an American, but ultimately Philippians chapter 3, verse 23 says, but our citizenship is in heaven, and it is from there that we are expecting our Savior, the Lord Jesus Christ. And we're not going to go down with this nation. We're going to stand tall for the kingdom of God. All right, let's bow our heads and we'll close with prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for the privilege, the freedom we enjoy here to gather here tonight. I pray that you will bless us during these Sabbath hours as we discuss these important and significant topics. Father, it's no longer business as usual. We sense the end of time drawing close. We see that as a nation, as around the world, we are shaking our fist in your face, and we see the tragedy of children caught up in chaos beyond their wildest imaginations. And so, Father, we pray that you do come soon and put an end to this world of sin and sorrow, that children will no longer be hurt, and parents will no longer be heartbroken, and young people will no longer live in a state of confusion, but all things will be made new, and every tear will be wiped away. Father, may that day come soon. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Okay, so we look